This is the brand new F4U Corsair in 1:48 scale from Magic Factory. In this video I'm going to build the Night Fighter option of this duo combo set in the out-of-the-box style. I hope this will give you the best possible point of view to assess whether or not you like this kit. The kit itself was kindly provided to me by Magic Factory. Not only that, but Magic Factory will give one of you, my viewers, their brand spanking new A-4M Skyhawk. More on how you can be the lucky winner a little bit later in the video. As usually, all starts in the cockpit, where we get sizable amount of parts to work with. From what I could find as reference images, it appears that Magic Factory have represented the cockpit structure quite faithfully. Initial impressions are that the plastic is medium soft and for now pretty enjoyable to work with. The sprue gates are placed conveniently away from important details on most parts. One major exception I can point out is the gun sight, which has the gate attached directly over the glass portion. But there is a part inclined to clean up anyways, so this might be the thinking behind the placement decision. When assembling any of the variants offered in this kit, it is important to make some identification in the instruction booklet because it is easy to confuse things. Contrary to my expectations, a lot of the cockpit details are different. The other option is the F4U-1D, by the way. After my initial assessment and general parts cleanup, I glued together a few parts that allowed to be painted together without too much difficulty. For the majority of the assemblies, the fit is excellent. For instance, the way that the seat frame mounts to the bulkhead is absolutely flawless. Unfortunately, there are a few instances where the fit lacked any kind of authority and I was left scratching my head about angles and whatnot. The pilot seat is offered as a single plastic part with additional photo etch plate and also photo etch seat belts. On the plastic where the photo etch plate is supposed to fit, there are two grooves which accept the aforementioned plate and lock it in place very conveniently. After super gluing this in place, I removed the excess glue with the bonder. This chemical is very useful but can damage the plastic, so should be used with care. The photo etch belts are quite thick in my opinion. This is true for the rest of the photo etch details, but that is irrelevant as there will be no need for bending with them. To make the seat belts a bit more pliable, I subjected them to some heat, actually to a lot of heat, and left them to cool down naturally. Before I could start bending them, I sanded the contact surfaces with 220 grit sandpaper because I always have issues with super glue to photo etch adhesion. After all this prep work, I had relatively easy installation and was even able to put one of the belts in slightly different fashion than what the kit designers intended. The kit also comes with two sheets of pre-cut masks. For the bulletproof glass that sits in front of the pilot, we get masks for both sides. Well, it is time to paint the interior of the birdcage Corsair. After an overall black primer layer, it was time for the interior color. This time I chose to use my freshly bought interior green from MRP. Those paints spray very well, and the added convenience of pre-tint paint made my choice easy. Moreover, the color looks very good, so I can recommend this specific paint. Unfortunately, this color was the wrong choice for our subject, and I will rectify this mistake later on. I left this episode in the video because I want to be transparent and to show you everything, even my mistakes. A few ejector pin marks popped up in between the ribbing detail on the fuselage halves, but since those will be buried deep inside the cockpit, I decided to leave them alone. Is this going to bite me back? We shall see soon. After I detached the clear parts from the sprue, I went ahead and masked them using the provided masking sheet. I have to say that this is probably the most accurate and precise set of masks that I have ever used. Great stuff. My only complaint here is that the kit does not provide masks for the internal side of the transparencies. Links for the tools and materials I use you can find under this video. Next up, I moved on the wings. I detached almost all parts from the sprues and gave them a good cleanup. The assembly was quite straightforward and easy. The main spar offers excellent attachment points to fix the center in place, and it is a matter of carefully going around and gluing the rest in position. Locating it is conveniently everywhere, so not much to think about. Same goes for the gear bay walls. They slot into slits in the main spar, and again with some careful adjustments, all gets glued together nicely. The inner gun bay walls sit only on the wing, and the angle is not set. For this reason, I installed the top wing parts and made sure that the walls sit correctly. The ammo belt housing is also a bit less secured in the position. Those parts rely on two small pins that should end up in two small holes in the wing. Once again, to make sure everything is put together as it should be, I temporarily installed the top wing parts. So far so good. Removing some more parts, I started noticing more ejector pin marks. Some will be hidden, but some will need to be addressed. Those mostly occur on two-faced parts, and I guess it is not possible not to have them. In my research, I found a blog which neatly explains the differences between the F4U-2 Night Fighter version and the early F4U-1, which are the base airframe. This discovery made me do some changes, and I will have to do some more. Link to that wonderful well of knowledge I will leave in the description under this video. One of the things I changed so far is the belly window, which is supposed to be painted over apparently. So I removed the masking and decided to install the braces and do the painting of this assembly at once. Also, I assembled the tail hook, which is very fiddly and delicate two-piece construction, not really pleasant to clean up from the molding imperfections. Finally gathered all the necessary pieces to continue painting and eventually assemble the airframe. One point I have to note is that one either has to paint the transparencies right after the application of the masks, or otherwise great care must be taken because the masks on the curvy parts will lift, and you can guess what kind of trouble that would be if left unattended. Also, you may notice that the cockpit is in black primer once again. Well, this is the product of me finding the right information a bit too late. So apparently the interior color should be the dark green, and not the interior green as the instruction suggests, and what later F4U-1Ds sported. Initially I thought of buying MRP's offering, but on pictures the color did not look very accurate. What I did was to mix some bronze green, black in the form of Mr. Surfacer black primer, and some RLM70 black green. The last was added in order to retain the green in the mixture, because the mix of the first two colors produced much more bluish color than I wanted. With that, I hope I am a bit closer to reality. Following the original recipe, I mixed yellow zinc chromate with red and got what looks like a salmon pink primer color. That I applied in the gun base, the tail wheel well, and in the interior of the fuselage. This primer was used as a secondary coat over the yellow zinc chromate primer, so that the inspectors could verify that there are two layers of primer applied. Have to say that the combination of dull dark green and salmon pink looks dreadful. Now time for subtle highlights. Using neutral grey oil paint together with the dry brushing technique, I applied the highlights over the raised details and some of the flat areas. Unlike traditional dry brushing, the oil paint does not create a lot of contrast. The oil paint simply does not leave a layer of paint over the base color, but rather a thin filter film. This also allows me to use the same oil paint color over two radically different colors. I left this to cure over the weekend in hope that after I apply the varnish, the oil paint is not going to disappear. And to my surprise, the clear coat application went pretty much perfect. Almost none of the highlight strength was lost, so let's proceed forward. Before I can paint the main gear bay, I need to prepare the bay doors. The big doors are molded cleanly and the sprue gates are located only on the lip, which makes them a lot easier to clean up. Unlike the main gear bay doors, the ones that attach on the gear legs and those for the tail wheel well need some sanding before any paint could land on them. A few ejector pin marks on each detail made the experience less than perfect. Not that it is particularly difficult to remove the set pin marks, but it is rather annoying. Allegedly, when the camo scheme was converted to the tricolor setup, the main gear bays were painted in the same insignia white color as the belly. On pictures, it is visible that the tail wheel well is in salmon primer, which might be due to the tight space making it difficult for painting. To paint the aforementioned areas, I used light gold grey of all things. Initially, I was going to use insignia white with a drop of black, but I already had premixed gold grey for the Phantom build, so I decided to make my life easier using what I already have. And why I did not use straight insignia white, we will see a little bit later. By the way, the instructions call for interior green, which is not the correct color as far as I know on any flavor of Corsair. Using Snow White oil paint, I dry brushed the white surfaces. Unlike the traditional dry brushing applications, I was not only aiming at highlighting the raised details, but also to apply white filter over the flat surfaces. This resulted in a dirty white overall appearance with whiter highlights on the edges and the details. As far as simple way to enhance the volume perception, I think this method is pretty much unbeatable. As it is by low now, I will leave those to cure for about 2 days before I come back with a gloss varnish and some washes. In this case, the washes come with the task to create forced shadows rather than dirt, but that too. For the salmon pink primer, I did my own mix of Starship Field and black oil paints. Very easy to apply on the gloss surface. Capillary action and the sleek nature of the oils makes the wash follow the crevices on its own. The color of the wash I also like a lot. Very subtle, but it still has impact on the overall picture. The green on the cockpit is much too dark for the aforementioned mixture. You may have heard me say this before, but let me make this clear. I avoid using straight black wash as much as possible. Here, however, it seems to be the only solution from what I have on the paint rack. So I busted out the Tamiya black panel line accent color and applied it on the green. Very conservatively at that. The removal of the excess wash when the wash is made out of oil paints and is on top of a glossy surface is pretty easy. A dry Q-tip is all it needs to come off. The Tamiya wash needs some mineral spirits and some agitation either with a brush or a Q-tip. In all cases, I really don't like using Q-tips because I find straight fibers all over details after I am done. Check out my YouTube membership program. Support the channel and get updates of my ongoing projects on a daily basis. The guns and their ammo belts are a nice detail to have in any kit. Here they are rendered reasonably well and should provide a nice visual candy once the model is assembled. Due to the presence of a radar, on the right wing one of the guns was removed to retain the balance of the aircraft. It is commendable that the instructions mention this fact when following the Night Fighter route. There are a few things that should be mentioned. On the middle gun, the sprue gate is attached on top of the connection point, so one must be careful not to clip it away together with the sprue gate. Also, on the guns that are closest to the fuselage, there are a couple of ejector pin marks. Subsequent weathering might make them more visible, so I took the time to remove them. Despite that there is a peg and a corresponding opening for each gun, the fit lacks authority. To overcome this issue, I held each gun in the gun bay using the ammo belt as a jig. This way I was able to glue each shoot to its gun in a more precise manner. Painting the ammo belt was a bit of a chore. First I masked off the projectile and the clip areas. Then I applied burnt iron from MRP, spraying it over the tape and never against it to avoid paint seeping under it. I applied that color also on the small windows in the ammo chutes. With the burnt iron done, I had to wait a couple of hours and I masked off the cartridge and clip areas to spray MRP copper over the projectiles. When the copper had enough time to cure, I ground down a soft graphite pencil on a piece of 600 grit sandpaper, effectively creating a pigment powder. Using a silicone brush, I rubbed that onto the black primer of the guns and the ammo belt clips. After a few days of drying, followed by a gloss varnish, the main gear base and their doors and the tail gear base doors got their fair share of darkened Starship field wash. After the oil paint turned matte, in essence dry, I removed the excess with Q-tips on the flatter areas and with a paintbrush and mineral spirit on the more complex surfaces. Q-tips, as mentioned, would have worked just fine everywhere, but I hate when fibers get caught on the details and make a mess. Other than that, I did some masking to facilitate the beginning of the detail painting. After that masking effort and some airbrushing work, I have all the control surfaces in the delightful LP65 rubber black. As you very well know, that's only the beginning of the journey for those guys, but I really like the color. Additionally, I sprayed the rubber black over the seat belts. This gives nice surface and color to paint over, as well as nice soft shadows along the belts. Mistakes are costly though. Fortunately, I got it right this time. I decided that the cockpit needs some more flair, so I added a small amount of Tamiya XF57 buff to the base color and applied that mixture in between the ribs, on some flat surfaces and on the spaces around the seat belts. Detail painting time. Now I'm going to try and take advantage of that rubber black base layer on the seat belts. To start, I used snow white oil paint and did something resembling zenithal lighting. Obviously, that would have been rather difficult to do with an airbrush only on the seat belts. That at this point because it will be easier to judge my brush strokes when the buckles are actually visible. To add the color, I used olive drop light base acrylic paint tint to a glaze consistency. Several layers later, I achieved a good coverage. The oil paint highlights were there but not nearly as visible as I wanted them to be. To give the highlights a bit more punch, I made a 50-50 mixture of the base color and dry light mud color. Using the faint remnants of the oil paint highlights as a guide, I applied the acrylic highlights and voila! I think it looks just about right. The map pouch was also a time-consuming task. First, I applied several coats of weathered wood acrylic paint until the coverage was somewhat even. After that, I created a few different mixes of the base color with dry light mud color and applied them in a way that I think is somewhat resembling a worn leather look. After that was done, I did a glaze layer of the base brown paint to tie everything together. With that dry, I used a less diluted brown to add a shadow layer around the details, mainly underneath the flap. And finally, I added highlights on the corners and the raised details with a 50-50 mixture of the base brown and dry light matte. The detail painting continues. For the pilot control surfaces, I chose to start with medium gray acrylic paint on some details, just to pick them out from the rest without being too striking. Then I did some dry brushing with snow white oil paint over all the details. To finish the coloring part, I added a few touches of red here and there. When I applied the gloss varnish, I expect it to melt some of the oil paint and make it less harsh looking. Having the gloss coat on and cured, I applied Tamiya black panel line accent color around the instrument bezels on the instrument panel and around the knobs and buttons on the side control consoles. After the wash was dry, I removed the excess using pointy Q-tip, fine brush and some mineral spirits. The goal was to leave some of the wash around the details and mostly remove it from everywhere else. With that done, I mixed some rapid thinner with Tamiya's lacquer based flat varnish. This gave me an absolutely delightful surface. The only downside of this varnish is the slightly milky appearance, but that's an issue with many matte varnishes. The cockpit also looks so much better when it is not glossy. With the flat varnish properly cured, I started adding some wear and tear. That was done using watercolor pencils only. First, using sand color, I did some superficial paint damage on the sidewalls and several other places. This might not be very realistic, but gives some visual texture and I think it can pass. Next up came the silver pencil, which I tried to apply on areas that make sense. The silver has a lot more kick than the sand color, therefore more thought went into the application. Very simple method, but gives so much. What you need to do for a chance to win the Skyhawk is just to leave a comment under the video within the first 48 hours of its publishing. To create the instrument glass look, this time I decided to use clear UV resin. One I have for the 3D printer. I carefully put drops of resin in each instrument face and then more carefully transferred that into the curing station. The resin remains in liquid form until properly blasted with UV rays, so it is going to spill over if the handler gets too excited. After the cure, the resin is hard and very transparent. In the reference materials I shared earlier, I found out that the front armored glass sitting on top of the instrument panel shroud was removed for better visibility. As it appears, the Magic Factory designers did not know that. All was going to be fine if I didn't know either, but now I know, and ruined that all for you too. Anyhow, some 2-part epoxy putty and some sanding later, the part is ready for painting and weathering. Again, as the time for the cockpit assembly seemed closer and closer, I guess I get too excited and failed to notice that there is a decal to be applied under the headrest. With the paint being flat, it's not an ideal situation to apply a decal, but thanks to the excellent decal's quality and some persistence, I managed to get rid of the silvering. Gluing the seat to the frame on the rear bulkhead is fairly easy, which goes for the headrest and the oxygen tank. The footrests under the pedals do not though. There is play in the joints, and that means that the correct angle does not come on itself. Fortunately, in the instructions we have side profiles of the cockpit That shows how things should go in relation to each other. The two parts instrument panel fits in its place okay. The joints do not have much authority, but overall it's not bad. Just keep an eye on the details while the glue is curing so they don't go somewhere else. I started with installing the gun sight in a shallow slot under the shroud. The slot does not grab the gun sight tightly, so I had to make sure it is centered in the shroud opening. The joint that mates the shroud on top of the instrument panel is excellent. The shroud fits snugly and no play is allowed. The front and rear bulkheads are connected with the side consoles. Here, the fit can be described as loose on both ends. Also, the control stick plays part having to go into an opening on each side, and it is not restrained from rotating. This promised to be a very flimsy construction, so I devised and executed the following plan. Using the Mr. Cement Deluxe, which is the slow drying cement, I covered all mating surfaces. Then I assembled the cockpit so that it is kind of aligned properly. The control stick I cemented to stay upright with the fastest Mr. Cement. After about 5 minutes the slow cement was already touch dry, but the part still moved about. To ensure I have perfect alignment and fit, I installed the cockpit in its proper location inside the fuselage and taped that all together. Essentially, the fuselage turned into a jig. The good thing is that the fit between the cockpit and the fuselage is excellent, which allowed this approach. Looking at it, I cannot see any fault in the design of the cockpit. It is just the nature of the beast. If we want an accurate representation, sometimes it's going to be more than shake and bake. And this will be all for today's episode. I really hope to see you in the next one. Until then, happy modeling, fellas.